welcome to a new episode of The Geopolitical Pickle. My name is Juan Francisco Muñoz, and I'm as always joined by my colleague Ronan Wordsford. How are you doing, Ronan?
I'm going all right, thanks, Juan. Pretty tired, obviously, with the young guy, but other than that, keeping good. How are you doing?
Well, I don't know who's sleeping less lately, because I've been working at night, so it hasn't been easy.
Oh, one thing I would say for everyone that's listening out there, if you want something to read late at night, and if you haven't already, subscribe to our newsletter. You can find the links below wherever you listen to this podcast. And I think that is something that comes out every 2 weeks. Great companion before bed reading material, I reckon.
And if you want to fall asleep while listening to something, you can always listen to some of our earlier episodes because some of them are a bit, there's a lot of information. So you can fall asleep. And, I don't know if you used to do this, Ronan, but when I was studying, I did many times record my notes and I would listen to them while I was sleeping, because someone told me that if I kept on being in the loop of the information, that I would wake up and I would have the information in my head,
I don't know if it works like that, but it's worth a try.
Someone told me that, and I remember it was a double-fold thing, because, you need to record it, so you're studying that way, and then you listen to it at night. I don't know. I don't know if it worked. I passed everything, so we can put it there. But yeah, let's get to today's topic. And today's topic brings you back home, doesn't it, Ronan?
It does indeed. So obviously, we recently had our federal elections in Australia at the same week actually, as another one of our Five Eyes countries in Canada had their federal elections. And both of these elections were have a lot of similarities as well as a few key differences, which will be good to explore today, and how the geopolitics of the situation at the moment played into the two elections.
What would be the difference in how do you approach someone? Like, I know in Australia you guys say, oi. You tell people, oi, mate. How would you call that in Canada? Do you know how would you say that in Canada?
I don't want to offend any Canadians. Yes, I don't want to hazard and put on a terrible Canadian accent, but...
Maybe they could say it in French. Maybe they could say
Quebec. In Quebec.
Yeah. Okay, so let's just get a bit of understanding of the elections. So let's start with Canada, and then we get back to Canberra. In Canada, the election was actually a surprise, because the polls prior to the election, as early as January 6, 2025, they were showing a victory of the Conservatives. The Liberals, who were in power with Prime Minister Trudeau, had lost confidence. It was 2 mandates already of Justin Trudeau. He already said that he was going to resign late 2024. And the polls were not looking good. Literally, there were 24 points of difference in the poll, in the intention of voting between the Liberals and the Conservatives.
Yeah, if we look at the turn of the year, I think that's important to know. Obviously, Trudeau's Liberal Party in Canada, which is their centre-left party, have been in power for just a little over a decade, but they hit historic lows just at the turn of the year. They were just around 20%, as opposed to, as you said, 45% for the Conservatives, and almost 20%. They were almost overtaken as a second party by the New Democratic Party, a further more progressive left party, I would say. And that was basically the position with Trudeau as Prime Minister. Obviously, he'd served 2 full terms, and I think there was a growing malaise maybe with his governance style and this issue that comes with a lot of incumbents as well. I think especially as well in the period post-COVID, where we've had economic decline around a lot of the developed world, and not necessarily the same pickup. So we've had similar issues around inflation, around cost of living, become really central issues in all of the developed Western world, I would say.
Yes, also with housing, they also part of this global housing crisis. But then Trump's inauguration happens, and the Liberal Party, boom, spikes up. And in the election, in the end, they won with 43.8% of the vote. So basically, they more than doubled their intention of vote in January. And this has a lot to do with Trump in himself, because there's been a massive reaction in the Canadian people against the American government due to his rhetoric, constantly referring to Canada as the 51st state, calling for annexation of Canada, calling Justin Trudeau, former Prime Minister, governor of Canada instead of Prime Minister, and basically harming the long-standing relation between the United States and Canada, which are were arguably, the tightest allies. And within 3-4 months, we've even seen images of people booing the American anthem when playing hockey and stuff like this, and a really reactive reaction from the Canadian people with problems such as the tariffs, for example, that were imposed to Mexico and Canada in the beginning of the Trump administration and that are still in place, boycotting American products in the supermarkets and so on. So yeah, this has definitely made a huge impact that has changed the tide in Canadian politics.
Absolutely. I think you can't look at the Canadian election without thinking about the shadow of Trump's initial 3 or 4 months in office and how that actually played out in impacted the election. I think for the Conservative, Pierre Poilievre, the leader of the Conservative Party, he must have been really angry every time Trump opened his mouth, even though he tried to distance himself in the latter part of the campaign from Trump. If we look at his rhetoric earlier on, was very much similar to Trumpian style rhetoric about making Canada great again, taking back control of their exports, etc., and their migration. But then as the election drew closer, and you could see the polling numbers rapidly start to turn around for the Liberal Party.
I don't think I've ever seen such a stat, to be
exactly
fair.
Such a massive turnaround within the space of 3 months. You see him try to push away from and try and present a separate idea from a conservative from the Trump-led Republican Party, but obviously that didn't necessarily work. So if we look, just looking at the polling in the lead-up, no matter which poll you looked at, between 75 and 90% of Canadians said that they will never, ever consider even joining the US under any circumstances. Notwithstanding, we covered this in other podcasts already this year, but the logistics of that actually happening is kind of baffling to think about, because Canada would become immediately the most powerful state in the US. So I don't really understand what the end goal is there, but that's beside the point. I think when you, as you said, for the US, probably Canada and Australia, the two, and the UK are the real close allies since the end of World War II.
Yeah.
And for them to treat their neighbor like that, I think was very much frowned upon in this.
It was really bold. Honestly, as you said, we've already talked about this in the past, but claims of Canada fueling the fentanyl trade towards the United States, or being a source of illegal migration towards the United States,
let's look at the statistics there of border seizures of fentanyl from Canada into the US. From 2022 to 2024, there was 59 pounds of fentanyl seized at the border there, as opposed to coming from the Mexican border, where there was 61,900 pounds. So more than 1,000 times the amount. So when you're talking about scales, obviously there's an understandable pushback against this idea that they're putting tariffs on because of the fentanyl crisis. And I think people can listen back to our episode on the tariffs from earlier this year to go into a bit more depth about why maybe Trump was thinking to use these tariffs. But obviously that has really annoyed a major section of the Canadian population and turned them and galvanized this support around the Canada, the people that were seen to stand up for Canada against Trump in this way.
Which I think is going to start, I don't know how you perceive it, but it may start a trend where previously states that were aligned with the United States, their population would have a favorable idea, idea of candidates that would support this Atlantic connection, these Western-focused policies based in the US and so on. But now it may actually fire back at the same parties, and parties will adapt. They will change their rhetoric, and in this case, maybe this fighting against the tariffs, fighting against claims made by a really bold United States administration can give the opposite results of that they were expecting.
Well, just before we go, like to just go on to Carney himself, like the guy that won the leadership from Justin Trudeau about bit over a month before the elections. He himself he's an economist by trade, PhD in economics, and was the first foreign reserve bank governor of England. He's also been the governor of the Bank of Canada. And so I think for Canada, they saw him very much as the right man for the right moment. He's not necessarily this populist, charismatic guy. He can talk in front of the media, etc., but he doesn't have charisma. He does have some charisma, but he's not a typical politician, we'll say. And he hasn't come through politics the same way other people have. So I think if we look, he wasn't even a member of parliament when he was elected the prime minister, which is highly unusual, but it goes into the Westminster system, which we have in Australia as well. And it's the parties elect the leader. So they had to basically have someone to stand in for him in the parliament until he could win a by-election and claim the seat. So I think this outsider presence, and then him being an economist by trade, and as I said, Reserve Bank governor of England and the Bank of Canada, gives him like this credibility in this age of tariffs to be able to know the right moves to stand up to the Trump administration's belligerence towards Canada.
And since he gained office, he's also have a really strong stance, also, or more than strong, I would say calm stance when dealing with the American administration. Like he's gone to the White House in this couch set up with the cameras that now we're getting so used to see in the Oval Office in the
Oval Office reality TV room.
Exactly, yes, in the Oval Office reality TV. They could probably have a channel that is got Oval Office reality TV, OORTV. I mean, it could work. But yeah, even there, Trump was making some claims of like, well, maybe Canada one day will be for sale and stuff like this. And very swiftly, he dismissed all these comments from Donald Trump in a way that, at least from outside, it didn't seem too conflicted, but it seemed firm, which is something that I'm pretty sure the Canadian people would appreciate in this situation.
Exactly, because I mean, for Canada as well, the US is always going to be their largest trading partner. It's their neighbor. They've got so much integrated industries together. I mean, this is part of why the tariffs never made sense in the first place. But if the US is going down this route, they need to also stand up for themselves and defend themselves while maintaining that the door is open for this relationship to kind of go back.
And in this sense now, the latest figures show that, for example, although Canada had aimed and followed a little bit the lead of the United States with the trade war with China in the past few years, now, and Carney has expressed that China and Canada don't share the same idea of global trade. It is also now a reality that China has become the largest importer of Canadian oil,
specifically from their new Trans Mountain pipeline, which it goes down the west coast and was meant to service the US market. But again, Trump slapped tariffs on the oil as well, and China kind of in this opportunistic moment see an opportunity to reach out to Canada, A, and B, they're trying to diversify supplies away from Russia because of the potential vulnerabilities that could expose them to by over depending on Russian oil and gas in the future.
Exactly. And because Russian refineries are not safe haven anymore, and they've been hit by Ukrainians for a while now. So yeah, there's that. You wanna go with your nation? You wanna become patriotic here?
Yeah,
let's go with Australia.
Let's go to Australia. I mean, so just to give a bit of background, no sitting prime minister has won back-to-back elections in Australia since John Howard did in 2003. So we're actually around 20 odd years since that happened. We had parties retain power, but it was always with the transition of leader in that time. And so this was kind of expect, like the trend was for the same thing to happen. If we look to the turn of the year, similar to Canada, our Conservative Party, which are actually called the Liberal Party or the Liberal National Party, it's a coalition between a Liberal Party and a National Party, which is more rural area voters, but they've been combined as a coalition for almost 100 years in some state or another. So when we talk about the Liberal Party in Australia, it means the centre-right Conservative Party. And then the ALP, the Australian Labor Party, is the centre-left party. And that's the party of Prime Minister Anthony Albanese. And in the last parliament, there was 151 seats in the lower house, and he had just 78 or 77. So just a very, very slight majority, needing 76 for a majority, a majority of 2. And so that means like you don't have necessarily the flexibility. If you have some of your own party go against a bill, it will not pass the House of Representatives. We see the same thing in the US House at the moment, where we have this conflict where there's a narrow majority for the Republicans, and you can sort of torpedo a bill from your own party if you don't get the changes you want. So it's kind of not a weak position, but not like a minority government potentially, but also not a super strong position. And all the polls were predicting at the turn of the year, basically, they were going to lose. And then we saw the same sort of effect in Australia following Trump being inaugurated and starting these worldwide tariff wars, we'll call them, about this quick increase in popularity and decline in popularity of the centre-right party. So the very similar kind of thing played out. Obviously, Australia doesn't feel the same direct threat from the US. They also have maintained that a lot of our partnerships are going to continue, but they also did put 10% tariff on Australia, like the rest of the world, as a blanket measure, and put a 25% on our steel and aluminium products, like the rest of the world. Even though Australia has consistently been for the last decade one of the top 3 trade surpluses for the US, meaning that the whole rationale of how Trump sees trade as a zero-sum game, which is economically speaking incorrect, but that's how he sees it. Even that rationale is out the window for Australia. So,
it happens out of these 3 main allies of the United States that you were mentioning before, Canada, UK, Australia. The only one with a trade surplus was Canada?
Yeah, trade deficit.
Sorry, trade deficit.
Exactly. Like UK also has trade surplus. Canada has quite a substantial trade deficit, but that is because partially the population size and you look at the products that they're exchanging, it's much more integrated economies, whereas like Australia's largest trade partner by a significant margin is China, and that has been the case for almost 20 years now. Like we see Australian economy very closely linked to the Chinese economy, and when they go through a slump, we'll go through a slump as well. But then fast forward to the election, which was May 3rd, I believe, just a few weeks back. And as I said, the polls had been changing in the lead up to the election, but most polls predicted like a very close to 70. So quirk of the system, this year we only had 150 seats in the parliament. Most polls predicted Labor to win anywhere between like 70 and 80, meaning they could be in a minority or a slight majority again. And then what we actually saw is a massive Labor win, one of their biggest wins of all time. They will most likely win 94 seats in the end, which is obviously a massive majority. And the Liberal National Party coalition are on track for a historic low for them as well. They're 43 and most likely will remain that way. So there was a huge gulf between the two parties in seats in Parliament now. And I mean, even the Liberal National Party have been talking about potentially having a split between their coalition. They announced a formal split and then rescinded it. And, you know, there's this whole...
Yeah, there's a bit of crisis going on there.
Bit of soul searching, I think, from the LNP about what direction they want to take the party from now, based on the scale of this loss. Because, again, like in Canada, Peter Dutton, the opposition leader, in the lead up to the election, if we look back in January and end of last year, they were also calling for a Department of Government Efficiency, just like we saw Elon Musk in the White House and going across all the US administration systems. And I think people have really seen how that has played out in the US and not wanted to replicate anything like that back home. So again, that's gone really badly for him. I think also stirring up talk about immigration, but Australia doesn't have a lot of immigration. So I think this is something that always gets brought up in Australia.
Immigration that you have, you're a pretty close country in general terms.
Exactly. I think it's something that always gets pulled out in Australian elections, but if we look at actual numbers, our immigration rate is extremely low. And then there was other kind of...
Then you need to get to Australia,
It's all right once you get there. That's it.
It's not on the map. One question that I have about Australia, we've heard a lot about, and we can see how Canada is really embedded in American culture, in North American culture, culturally, in arts, in sports. Australia, economically speaking, even like with companies going cross-border, is there a similar situation is that a similar situation of Australia with the United States, or because China is the largest trading partner, it's also a bit more regional focused?
Yeah, I think Australia is kind of a bit more diverse, I would say, in that sense. We don't, like, culturally, American sports are not necessarily our thing. We have a lot of the British sports, then we have our own sports like Aussie rules. Mm-hmm. And then that's our biggest ball sport in Australia, and no one else really plays it outside of Australia. Then we do have a lot of immigration for over the last 150 years from Southeast Asia, China, through different immigration waves. So there is very diverse culture in Australia, which is not necessarily... We definitely see ourselves quite different to the American culture, for sure. I would classify it kind of a mixture between... somewhere in between the UK and America, and then mix in that Southeast Asian
with kangaroos
mix and some kangaroos, and that's where you get it to us with Australia. So I think it's kind of much more dissimilar than Canada is to America, for sure.
And historically, what has been the impact of American administrations, for example, in Australia? Like it, obviously, you're part of Quad, part of AUKUS. Is or has historically been like a strong influence of who was in the United States for who will be a president and a prime minister in Australia, or
not really? There hasn't been a correlation much at all between the leaders. What I would say is bipartisan for both Republican Democrats in the US, and bipartisan for both ALP and for the Liberals in Australia. For US to always be our number one security partner. And that has been the case basically since World War II. And as you mentioned, obviously, I think AUKUS is the closest of these security arrangements, and that was signed under the previous Conservative government and was continued on without any question by the ALP since then. And I think if we think about Australia, we followed them into Afghanistan, we followed them into Iraq. We've basically always gone and stood side by side with America in terms of military engagements. So security partnership-wise, that is definitely our DNA over the last 80 years. However, as you said, economically-wise, they're not a major trading partner. They come in at fourth or fifth usually in our exports from Australia, behind China, Japan, South Korea are the big three, which make up usually around 60% of our export market. So then, in that sense, we always play this kind of balancing act between having decent relations with China to have especially good trade relations, but also diplomatic relations. I think one of our previous prime ministers spoke Mandarin, and he was often going to China to negotiate with different deals for Australia. And so I think that's definitely still very important. I think people understand that in Australia as well.
Okay, that's pretty interesting. Because then we can say, would it be feasible to say that there's been like the influence of the Trump administration taking place in Australian election has not been necessarily the messages that the Trump administration was giving about Australia, but the first results seen in the public of the Trump administration actions in the U.S.
Exactly. I think it's much more the latter, because if we look, foreign policy didn't really form much of the debate between the major parties in the lead up to the election. However, as you said, just being associated with these Trump-like policies, and as they were at the turn of the year, I mean, one of the ministers from the Conservative Party was wearing a "Make Australia Great Again" hat, and she went to the Republican Congress.
I fit with MAGA. It's still the same letter.
Exactly. And then tried to say that she's nothing like Trump at all. But I mean, people can see with their eyes what the situation was. And as you said, it's not necessarily a direct result of what America's doing, but more a perception of, we don't want that to happen to our country. And I think that was one of the main drivers, which is different to the driver for Canada, I guess, which is more an existential threat and a feeling of betrayal of your closest neighbor.
Yeah. And would you say that the trust in the United States among the Australian population has been harmed the same way, probably not the same way as Canada, because as you just said, it can be perceived as an existential threat. But I mean, for example, the fact of Trump putting tariffs on Heard and McDonald Island, which are basically populated by penguins, but they are part. As far as I understand, you more or less discovered that McDonald Island existed when these tariffs came into place.
I mean, I know Australia has some islands near the Antarctic. I would never have been able to tell you where they were or what they were called. And I think the last people who inhabited it were like in the 1970s. So now it is just penguins there, and they still got the tariffs, which I'm sure people have seen the memes about that.
Yes.
But I think if we look at Australian public perception, we still need US to be a major security partner and realize that. And so there has been the approach under AUKUS to the new administration. We've seen Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth meet with the Australian Defense Minister and underwrite a commitment to investing in US shipbuilding facilities. For instance, there was $500 million released, the first part of $3 billion, to help US shipbuilding to be able to produce new submarines to be able to supply Australia. So that's one part. But then the other part is there is this kind of urgent feeling of need to not put all their eggs in the American basket. I think this is not unique to Australia. We see Japan, South Korea, other US allies in the Indo-Pacific suddenly start to question. I mean, this whole alliance structure was built by the US for the US and was dragging in these partners. And then the kind of isolationism we've seen from the White House has, I guess, shocked some of the people. I think if we look at the Australian public's perception, 64% of Australians said that they do not hold very much trust or no trust at all in the US as the leader to act responsibly in the world. And 81% of people said that they completely disapprove of using tariffs to pressure other countries, for instance. So I think these tactics have come across extremely negatively in Australian public perception. However, again, it's this balancing act that we're still tied into AUKUS to the tune of $360 billion over the next 20 years just to get these nuclear submarines. And then, again, that's not just the whole part of AUKUS. I think we had a podcast on this before, but there's a second pillar as well, which is much more integrated information technology sharing and development of missile systems, et cetera, which is also going to be super important into the future. So that also isn't going to change. And so then we can still be, I would say, frustrated at what you see happening there while understanding the realities that they're still our close ally. And I think that's kind of what we see in Canada as well. Obviously, we talked about they still not trying to be outwardly aggressive or anything towards the US, and Carney's approach has been to be kind of calm and measured in his approach. And I think this is kind of how we see the whole world. The EU is doing the same balancing act at the moment as well, while they're being accused of Trump of being set up to be an anti-US alliance, which is a nonsense. But that's it.
We could analyze
That's
that.
beside this point exactly, but we see this same kind of balancing act between all the countries around the world, and Keir Starmer in the UK is doing the same sort of sales pitch
Yes.
around Trump. Basically, you got to appease his ego in some way, and then at least show that you're working with them
Yes.
on their preferred topics.
Yes, I mean, I think we can both agree that this is going to be the dynamic in the near future. I want to, I don't know if you have something else that you would like to say about these two. I find them really interesting. We already spoke about AUKUS in the past. We will leave the episode in the description because there's a really good analysis of what Australia, UK, US defense association is right now at the level. Is probably the deepest one in the world between the states.
The only other thing, like if we think about Trump trying to get people to buy into his full pressure on China tactic, I think what's noteworthy is the Australian Trade Minister Don Farrell has basically come out and said we will under no circumstances be joining the US on their tariffs against Beijing. This is something that is basically off limits completely. I think also an interesting side note is that the Australian-Canadian relationship might have improved following this period of Trump. We saw Canada sign with Australia's largest ever defense export contract for a new over-the-horizon radar system worth some almost 5 billion Australian dollars, or 6 billion Australian dollars, sorry. And that's to help Canada under their NORAD commitments. They were previously in talks with the US to develop something as well. The US has been in talks with Australia about this system as well. But then I think Canada went over and not behind the US's back, but just went on their own and approached Australia. And as I said, it's been a massive win for Australian economy as well, but also improving these bilateral ties between the two. Again, I would say real close allies of the US.
Interesting. I would like to highlight just two more elections that took place recently, and that in one of them we can see that the rest of the Western world doesn't necessarily have to follow the United States trend or have an impact of the US's policy in their internal policy. The case is Portugal. In Portugal, the Conservatives won with a massive uprise of the far right populist party. So we can see that the trend of polarizing keeps on happening in Europe. And the other example are the Romanian elections, which after the ruling of the Constitutional Court of
annulling the first round
because of alleged Russian influence in the election, and now the second in line for this pro-Russian movement in Romania was expected to win the election, or at least be really close, and well, he was really close in the end.
Well, it was some 800.
Yes, but it was a result like in his intention of vote, he definitely increased, but there were many more. The people went much more to the polls, so in the end, the once mayor of Bucharest, Nicu Sordan, from being independent, won the election, and it has a much more pro-European stance, although it is the Romanian government and the Romanian Electoral College, they were claiming that there was again Russian interference in the election through messages, through fake news, through basically manipulation of the public opinion. But still, the result gave to the more liberal, pro-European candidate the victory.
Yeah, I think if we look at the Romania election, it was, I guess, it would have been a huge shift in their foreign policy if George Simeon would have won, and I think would have sent shockwaves to Brussels for sure, because it would have been another Eastern flank member kind of with a pro-Russian stance.
You can join Hungary and Slovakia if you want.
Exactly. And this was some pushback from that. I think he won something like 42% in the first round of voting, which was significantly
41 and then 46.
Yeah. But he obviously plateaued somewhat from that first round. There was a lot of people that wanted to keep him out of power across Romania because of the perception of the damage that could be done to their economy. I mean, he has framed himself as a Trump-like politician himself. And I think they're...
Strong person, this concept of like the strong...
Exactly.
Yeah.
Which is interesting in itself, I think. We talked a few years ago about a populist wave potentially coming across Europe, and I think it's still here. It's still bubbling away under the surface. It traces its roots right back to the Eurozone financial crisis and then the subsequent immigration crisis in 2014 to 2016, and how Europe itself dealt with that and hasn't fully reckoned with that. And I think that's kind of what we see continuing to bubble away with these far right parties all across Europe. I think if you look at the UK, we have Reform. If we look at Germany, we have AfD. These parties with kind of record success for the far right parties in Europe, based on this platform, populist in rhetoric a lot of the time, but also anti-immigration and always saying that we need to stop the war with Russia. I think it's also interesting to look at some of where their funding comes from. Oftentimes, it's very shady sources and could be traced back sometimes to the Kremlin itself, but that's another issue altogether. But these populist people are tapping into a real existing feeling of grievance amongst the population that their life is actually not getting better. And I think while in Australia and Canada we saw, which I think is a definitive pushback to Trump, as we've elaborated here, and Trump style politics, I guess, not just Trump himself, but those style of politics. In Europe, there is still some undercurrent which can be tapped into by that. And I think that is still putting some fear into Brussels to say, like, this could play out in a really extreme party getting into power in a bigger country than, I mean, Hungary and Slovakia. These guys are politicians that have been in power for a long time. Fico was a president for a while before he's come back in his current iteration. I mean, him and Orban are both politicians. They're not really this iteration of the far-right AfD style.
They are populist leaders that basically they keep themselves in power.
They're opportunistic.
They're opportunistic, absolutely.
So I think they're a different category than what we've seen swelling up in a lot of European countries. And so I think this is something to take note of for sure about how this progresses with this, whether it will continue to have effectiveness as the effects on the global economy and the effects in US start to be felt from Trump's actions, whether this association with being like Trump is considered continuously to be favorable amongst these certain groups of far right and populist leaders in Europe, or we see similar thing to Australia and Canada, where we see a sharp shift away from that rhetoric and the resultant more centrist ground.
Yeah, going back to the center in a way.
From both parties, because I think if we see like center left, center right, what we see from these parties is far right, right? They're taking ground from the center right, but they're dragging the whole system further right.
Yes. They put the left has to become center.
Exactly. So whether we might see some sort of shift back and normalization of the system or not, I think that's something to watch over the next 12 months.
Yes, we will see. Well, just to close this, how do you feel about the new government in Australia?
I feel optimistic. I think that they have a strong mandate, and I think if we see some really progressive changes is what Australia needs to get out of this stagnation. I think we're an economy that's been built too reliant on housing and things like this for a long time, and we need new avenues to generate economic growth. And I will wait and see in a few years' time, but I think I'm optimistic. I think for me personally, I think we'll be in a better place in a few years' time than we would have been if the alternative government had been elected, for sure. That is no doubt in my mind.
Okay. Well, we'll look forward to that, and we will definitely analyze it when the time comes. And I think this is all for today. Thank you very much for listening, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time on the Geopolitical Pickle.
The Geopolitical Pickle is created by Ronan Wordsworth and Juan Francisco Muñoz. Follow us on Instagram at The Geopolitical Pickle or Twitter at The Geopickle for more content, and follow us on every podcast platform.